In the heart of São Paulo, where traffic never truly sleeps and concrete stretches to the horizon, there once stood a prison so large it felt less like a building and more like a city that had been sealed off from the world. From the outside, Carandiru Penitentiary looked cold, bureaucratic, almost ordinary. But behind its walls existed a reality that Brazil would spend decades trying to forget. Carandiru was built to contain criminals. Instead, it became a pressure chamber for human despair. Officially known as the Casa de Detenção de São Paulo, the prison was designed in the early 20th century to house just over 3,000 inmates. By the time it reached its most infamous years, more than 8,000 men were crammed inside. Cells meant for two held 5 or 6. Hallways became bedrooms. Stairwells turned into marketplaces. The prison was no longer governed by its architects or even the state. It was governed by survival. Guards controlled the gates. Inmates controlled everything else. Inside Carandiru, power did not come from uniforms or paperwork. It came from numbers, reputation, and violence. Each pavilion functioned like its own neighborhood, complete with leaders, enforcers, and unwritten rules. Disputes were settled quickly, often brutally, because lingering conflict meant weakness, and weakness meant death. Pavilion 9 was the most crowded of them all. The air inside it was thick with heat, sweat, and decay. Ventilation barely worked. Water was rationed. Disease moved freely. Tuberculosis and HIV spread faster than any effort to stop them. And medical care was so limited that illness often became a death sentence. If you collapsed in your cell, you depended on other inmates to decide whether you lived long enough to be noticed. At night, the prison never truly went quiet. Radios murmured. Men whispered plans and prayers. Somewhere, someone was always screaming. The guards rarely entered the cell blocks, and when they did, they came armed, tense, and afraid. Carandiru had learned to run itself, and the state had learned to look away. Murders were common. Investigations were rare. Bodies were sometimes found days later, hidden beneath thin mattresses or behind makeshift walls of trash. In other cases, they were simply carried out wrapped in sheets, another number added to an already long list. Life inside Carandiru was cheap, not because it had no value, but because there were too many lives and too little control. And yet, within that chaos, routines formed. Men cooked on improvised stoves. They played cards, traded favors, shared stories of the outside world like myths from another life. Some found religion. Others found power. Many found nothing at all except the slow realization that the prison was not a temporary stop. It was an ecosystem designed to grind men down until they adapted or disappeared. Then came October 2nd, 1992. The morning began like any other. Heat pressed down on the concrete. The smell of sweat and sewage hung in the air. In Pavilion 9, tensions were already high, fueled by overcrowding and long-standing grudges. At some point, no one can say exactly when, a fight broke out between inmates. What started as a fistfight escalated quickly. Blades appeared. Blood hit the floor. Attempts to contain it from inside failed. Guards, watching from beyond the bars, reported the violence. This was not unusual. But something about this incident, its scale, its intensity, triggered a response that Carandiru had never fully seen before. Instead of negotiations, instead of waiting for inmate leaders to restore order, the call went out to the military police of São Paulo. Armed units arrived in force. Rifles, helmets, body armor. Men trained for urban warfare, not prison mediation, took positions around Pavilion 9. From inside the cells, inmates could hear boots on concrete and weapons being loaded. Panic spread. Some men barricaded doors. Others climbed onto beds and shouted that they were surrendering. Many believed that if they laid down their weapons, if they complied, they would survive. Those beliefs would not protect them. The order to retake the pavilion was given, and once it was, there was no turning back. Police stormed inside, firing as they advanced through the corridors. Bullets tore through metal bars, concrete walls, and human bodies. Men were shot while running, others while hiding, some while lying face down on the floor. Witnesses later described officers firing into cells without checking who was inside. There were no negotiations, no warnings that mattered. What unfolded was not a controlled operation. It was a slaughter fueled by fear, rage, and years of institutional failure. By the time the shooting stopped, Pavilion 9 was silent in a way Carandiru had never been before. The official death toll would be announced as 111 inmates killed. No police officers died. Photographs taken afterward showed bodies stacked in hallways, blood smeared across walls, bullet holes clustered at chest and head height. Autopsies would later reveal that many victims had been shot multiple times, some at close range. Evidence of execution was impossible to ignore. But justice would be slow and incomplete. The massacre sent shockwaves through Brazil and beyond, forcing the world to look inside Carandiru for the first time. Trials dragged on for years. Convictions were overturned. Responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy and politics. In the end, the prison itself was demolished, its concrete towers torn down and replaced with a public park. But destruction did not equal erasure, because Carandiru was never just a building. It was a warning, a place where neglect turned into policy, where overcrowding became violence, and where a system designed to contain crime ended up committing one of the worst atrocities in modern penal history. And long after the walls fell, the echoes of that day still linger, reminding the world what happens when a prison stops being a place of justice and becomes a warehouse for human lives. The silence that followed the gunfire inside Pavilion 9 was not peace, it was exhaustion. Smoke hung in the corridors, mixing with the metallic smell of blood and gunpowder. Survivors remained frozen where they had dropped, afraid that any movement might invite another burst of bullets. Some men lay pretending to be dead, eyes closed, breath shallow, hoping the boots passing nearby would keep moving. Others never had that chance. When the military police finally withdrew, the scale of what had happened became impossible to hide. Bodies were everywhere, on stairwells, in cells, piled against walls where men had tried to escape bullets that had nowhere else to go. The floor was slick. The walls were marked with dark stains that would never quite come out. And in the middle of it all stood a prison that no longer pretended to be under control. News of the massacre spread quickly beyond the prison gates. At first, official statements described a riot suppression operation. Authorities claimed inmates had been heavily armed, that officers acted in self-defense, that lethal force was unavoidable. But as journalists, doctors, and human rights groups began piecing together what really happened, that story began to collapse. Autopsies told a different truth. Many inmates had been shot in the head, chest, and back. Several were hit multiple times. Some had bullet wounds consistent with executions at close range. There were no signs that police had taken fire. No officers were seriously injured. The imbalance was undeniable. Brazil was forced to confront a question it had long avoided. What had Carandiru become? For families of the dead, answers came slowly, if they came at all. Identification of bodies was chaotic. Some victims were buried before relatives were notified. Others were returned in sealed coffins with strict instructions not to open them. Grief turned to anger, and anger turned into protests that filled the streets outside the demolished prison years later. Inside Carandiru, the survivors were left to process trauma in the same place it had been inflicted. The prison reopened. Life resumed. But something fundamental had changed. The massacre shattered the illusion that Carandiru was merely neglected. It was now exposed as a place where the state was willing to use overwhelming force without restraint, and then defend it. Trials followed, but justice moved like molasses. Years passed before commanders and officers were charged. When verdicts finally came, they were inconsistent, overturned, delayed, or dismissed entirely. Political pressure mounted. Public memory faded. And slowly, responsibility dissolved into the fog of bureaucracy. For many Brazilians, Carandiru became a symbol, not just of a massacre, but of a system that punished poverty far more harshly than crime. Most of the men killed that day had not been convicted of violent offences. Some were awaiting trial. Others were serving sentences for non-violent crimes. In Carandiru, guilt was not determined by a court, it was determined by proximity to disaster. In 2002, the prison was officially closed. Demolition crews moved in, tearing down the concrete towers one by one. Pavilion 9 came down last. As walls collapsed and dust filled the air, it felt as though São Paulo was trying to bury a memory it could no longer bear to look at. In its place, Parque da Juventude was built, a green space filled with trees, walking paths, and laughter. Children now play where men once bled to death. To some, the park represents healing. To others, it feels like erasure. But Carandiru did not disappear with the building. Its legacy lived on inside Brazil's prison system, and inside the criminal organizations that were born in its shadow. In the aftermath of the massacre, inmates across the country learned a brutal lesson. The state could not be trusted to protect them. Solidarity became survival. Organization became power. Within a year, The Primeiro Comando da Capital, the PCC, would emerge, founded by prisoners who cited Carandiru as proof that unity was the only defense against annihilation. What began as a protective brotherhood would eventually grow into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in South America. In that way, Carandiru did not end violence. It multiplied it. Today, the name still carries weight. It appears in documentaries, court transcripts, survivor testimonies, and whispered conversations among former inmates. For those who lived through it, October 2nd, 1992 is not history. It is memory. The sound of gunfire. The smell of blood. The realization that surrender meant nothing. Carandiru stands as a warning written in concrete and bone. When prisons become warehouses instead of institutions. When overcrowding replaces rehabilitation. When neglect hardens into policy. And when force becomes the first response instead of the last. What follows is not order, but catastrophe. And even after the walls fall, the damage remains. Years after the massacre, survivors would describe Carandiru as a place where time stopped working normally. Days blurred together, but certain moments, like October 2nd, remained painfully sharp. Men who had lived through stabbings, beatings, and years of confinement said the same thing. Nothing compared to the sound of automatic gunfire echoing through a space that was never meant to hear it. Inside the prison, fear settled into a permanent state. Those who survived Pavilion 9 were transferred, scattered across other facilities, carrying the memory with them. In new prisons, the story of Carandiru spread quickly, told in hushed tones and sharpened by trauma. It became a legend, not because it was exaggerated, but because it was so brutally real. A reminder that when things went wrong, there would be no mercy and no second chances. The Brazilian justice system struggled to contain the fallout. International human rights organizations condemned the massacre. Reports accused the state of excessive force and summary executions. Brazil, already grappling with rising crime and overcrowded prisons, found itself under a global spotlight. Officials promised reforms. Investigations were announced. Commissions were formed. And slowly, predictably, momentum faded. For the police officers involved, accountability was elusive. Some were convicted years later, only to have verdicts overturned on appeal. Others were never charged at all. Political leaders who authorized the operation distanced themselves from the decision. Responsibility fractured, splintered, and vanished into the gaps of a system designed to protect itself. What remained were numbers. 111 dead, hundreds wounded, thousands traumatized, and no clear resolution. In the years that followed, Brazil's prisons grew even more crowded. The conditions that had made Carandiru a powder keg were not eliminated. They were replicated. Facilities filled beyond capacity. Guards remained understaffed. Violence continued to be managed rather than solved. But inmates had learned something vital. Carandiru proved that isolation was fatal. That division made men expendable. Inside Brazil's prisons, alliances began forming across cell blocks and facilities. Rules were written. Codes enforced. Loyalty became protection. Out of that environment, criminal organizations flourished. The PCC did not emerge from nowhere. It was forged in the aftermath of Carandiru, shaped by the belief that survival required structure stronger than the state itself. Where the prison system failed, the organization filled the vacuum, offering protection, order, and retaliation. In a grim irony, the massacre that was meant to restore control instead fueled the rise of something far more powerful. Outside the prisons, public opinion remained divided. Some saw the massacre as a necessary evil, a hard response to uncontrollable criminals. Others saw it for what it was, a catastrophic failure of governance and humanity. The debate never fully resolved, because Carandiru existed at the intersection of fear and neglect, where moral clarity becomes uncomfortable. When the prison was finally demolished, the wrecking balls didn't just tear down walls, they buried evidence, memories, and unresolved questions. Concrete fell. Dust rose. And beneath it all lay the unspoken hope that if the structure disappeared, the shame might fade with it. But places like Carandiru don't disappear that easily. They live on in policy decisions, in prison overcrowding statistics, in the strategies of criminal groups, and in the nightmares of those who survived. Today, visitors walk through Parque da Juventude unaware that beneath the grass and trees lies ground once soaked in blood. Children laugh. Joggers pass by. Life continues. Yet for some, every step echoes with gunfire. Carandiru was not an accident. It was the end result of decades of neglect, overcrowding, and indifference, culminating in a single day when the state chose bullets over dialogue. And the lesson it offers is as uncomfortable as it is unavoidable. When a society builds prisons without humanity, when it locks people away without solutions, and when it responds to crisis with violence instead of restraint, the walls may contain the inmates, but the consequences will never stay inside. Carandiru was torn down, but its legacy still stands. Even now, decades later, one detail refuses to settle into history: the question of who truly made the decision. Because when the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, responsibility became a moving target. Orders were said to come from above, but above was never clearly defined. Police commanders claimed they were restoring order. Politicians claimed they were uninformed. Paper trails ended abruptly. Testimonies contradicted one another. Each layer of authority pointed upward or outward, until accountability dissolved into abstraction. No single hand ever fully claimed the trigger, and that uncertainty became part of Carandiru's final curse. Survivors spoke of officers who seemed panicked, others enraged, some disturbingly calm. They remembered shouting that they were surrendering. They remembered hands raised. They remembered men being told to lie down, only to be shot moments later. These stories never aligned neatly with official reports, yet they echoed one another with chilling consistency. Too consistent to ignore, too fragmented to prosecute cleanly. In the end, the massacre did not produce a clear villain, only a system that allowed violence to masquerade as necessity. As years passed, Carandiru slipped from headlines into textbooks, from outrage into footnotes. New crises emerged. New prisons overflowed. And the same logic quietly returned: control first, humanity later. Or never. For those who study Carandiru closely, the most disturbing aspect is not the gunfire, or even the death toll, it is how predictable it all was. Every warning sign had been there: overcrowding, disease, gang rule, abandoned oversight. The massacre was not a rupture. It was an outcome. A final, violent answer to a problem that had been ignored for decades. And yet, one question still lingers in the air, unresolved and unsettling. What if Pavilion 9 had been negotiated instead of invaded? What if the guards had waited? What if the men who surrendered had been believed? History offers no retrials. Carandiru was demolished, but no memorial stands at the site naming the dead. No permanent marker lists the 111 lives lost. The absence feels intentional, as if memory itself is dangerous, as if remembering too clearly might force uncomfortable truths back into the light. Because Carandiru is not just Brazil's story. It is a warning to every society that believes walls can replace solutions, that punishment alone can substitute for justice, and that violence can be neatly contained once unleashed. The prison is gone. The echoes are not. Somewhere between the orders that were given and the shots that were fired lies a truth that has never been fully uncovered, a truth buried beneath rubble, paperwork, and time. And that is where Carandiru truly ends. Not with closure, not with justice, but with suspicion that the real crime was never just what happened inside those walls, but how easily it was allowed to happen at all.